I knew that the images provided by NASA and other space agencies of stars and planets and galaxies were completely fake, but I was curious about microspace. I remembered the images I had seen when I was little of viruses. So there's a lot of fear involved with sickness and disease and things we cannot see. So I was curious as to whether they actually existed, and I decided to do some research. It's 2015. I figured surely by now we have millions of pictures of viruses, and much to my dismay, I couldn't find anything. They were the same old NASA-like CGI pictures and images, nothing real. There were no real pictures from an electron microscope of a virus, other than the handful of images I remember from when I was a kid. So I immediately just started looking into it more and more and finding so many holes in the theory of viruses. We really have never seen a clear picture of a virus. The only thing we see in these electron microscope pictures or images are just these round orbs. And then, once you realize what is required in order to view a sample under the electron microscope, you may not be so quick to accept the dots and squiggly lines as sufficient proof for the existence of these mythological beasts known as viruses. There are three things up front that, in my opinion, seriously call into question what we have assumed for so long. Number one is the power of the electron beam that is used, which destroys all living cells. Number two is the vacuum required for it to function, which immediately evaporates any water and would vaporize a biological sample. And number three is that all samples in transmission and scanning electron microscopes must be coated with a thin layer of metal, usually gold or gold palladium. This makes the sample conductive. And so the virus, too small to be visible under any optical microscope, can be located, captured, secured, have the water removed, and coated with metal for the finished product of a dot or squiggly line. That is unbelievable. And here is how the experts describe the process.
It's quite important to be very open-minded about what you're going to say. You need to make sure what you're looking at is actually real, so you can get quite a few artifacts, anything from dust that's fallen on your sample, which can look like a piece of sample. You can get some cracking in the vacuum, so you actually get cracks forming in your sample, which are not there, they've been caused by the microscope. Sometimes the coating can cause artifacts. If you coat too thickly, you can start to see the metal particles. And of course, if you're looking for small particles, they can look just like your sample might look like.
The environment inside an electron microscope is incredibly hostile to the living cell, so it needs to go through quite an elaborate process to enable it to survive that hostile environment. Firstly, we have a very high vacuum, and if you stick biological samples into a vacuum, they'll just escape very quickly and be destroyed. We have a very high energy electron beam which is required to be able to penetrate to the sample. When the electron beam strikes the sample, it gets very, very hot. It can get up to 150 degrees Celsius where the electron beam actually hits the sample. So it needs to be able to survive that very high temperature.
Usually the way to tell if something's an artifact is just from experience. So spending a lot of time looking at a whole lot of different samples, you'll see these things continually appearing.
Some of the important things to think about when you're interpreting data from the microscope is, do you understand your sample well enough to be able to interpret what you're seeing? There's just a lot of information. In fact, you could almost say that you're going to be overwhelmed by information when you get to the ultrastructural level. And unless you really know your sample well, then this information could actually be misleading. Do you have enough experience with the particular technique you're working to know what has gone on during the preparation of the sample and how it may have altered your sample? You also need to think very carefully about, have you introduced bias into the way you collected your sample? You may have tended to look for pretty areas rather than areas that are scientifically relevant.
Spatter coating is popping a really thin layer of metal on top of our sample surface. The layer we'd use is between 1 and 10 nanometres, so it's nice and thin. It's not going to cover up any of the sample, but it's going to add a nice wee layer so the sample becomes conductive. If the sample's not conductive, we won't see anything. So what will happen is the electrons that land on the sample and go through the sample can't get away to Earth, so they build up inside the sample and cause artifacts, which we call charging. So we'd get our sample, attach it to a holder so it's attached quite firmly. We'd load it into the splasher coater, shut everything up and create quite a high vacuum in the coater. We would then pass a voltage over the top of the coater where the metal target is sitting, and that creates a little electric field inside the coater itself. We then bleed gas into the chamber. The gas molecules get all excited and they kind of hoon around and knock little bits of the target material off. So those little bits of the target also move around inside the chamber quite randomly, and they find their way and land on top of the sample, creating quite a thin layer.
Now, there may be even more resistance to this idea that viruses are a complete fabrication, even more so than the flat Earth. If you say the flat Earth, people might just think you're crazy. But if you say, I don't even think viruses exist, they may think you're completely off your rocker. So it's actually that ingrained in us that these viruses exist. And that's how important it is that we be honest with ourselves and we look at everything with objective eyes and we say, okay, you're trying to give me medication or a vaccine or this or that. Well, prove to me that you even have isolated a virus, that you even know what a virus is, that this virus actually exists as you present it. So there are people out there, not as many as the Flat Earth movement or the fake space realization. You know, there's a book by Klaus Conlon, and it's titled How the Medical Industry Continually Invents Epidemics, Making Billion-Dollar Profits at Our Expense. And he shows that the alleged contagious viruses are just, in fact, particles produced by the cells themselves as a consequence of certain stress factors. So there's a lot of information out there. We need to discover a lot more information. And like I said, this is not a very popular topic, and there's not many people out there blowing the whistle on it. But I think that there are enough questions to be asked in this regard. Are viruses in fact real, or do they not exist? Can we not prove that they exist? Just like we can't prove certain things in space, I'm not sure we can prove many things in microspace that have been sold to us over the years.